Welcome to the podcast on North American literature, hosted by the research group Studies in American Literature and Culture from the University of Granada. My name is Thomas, and I'll be your host today. I'm thrilled to introduce a topic that bridges two fascinating texts from two very different eras: Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and Mark Levin's Liberty and Tyranny, a Conservative Manifesto. With us is Mia, a researcher whose latest work explores how Levin uses and reinterprets the Declaration in a rather curious way, right, Mia? Thank you so much for joining us today. Why don't you give us a little introduction?
Thank you for having me. It's truly a pleasure to be here and to share my research with such an audience. Well, the Declaration is timeless, and people such as Levin still uses it to justify their own ideologies. In Levin's case, well, it is modern conservatism.
That sounds absolutely fascinating. Let's set the stage for our listeners. Could you start by explaining the historical and philosophical significance of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence?
Certainly. Well, as you know, the Declaration of Independence is one of the most iconic documents in American history. It marked the official separation of the American colonies from the British rule and laid out universal principles that have since become synonymous with democracy. To sum it up, Jefferson argued that all individuals are endowed with unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These ideas were revolutionary at the time. They actually reflected perfectly the ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers and challenged the systems of monarchy and colonialism.
So, the Declaration wasn't just about breaking away from Britain's rule, but also about articulating a vision for governance and individual rights, isn't it?
Exactly. Jefferson envisioned a government that derived its authority from the consent of the governed and existed to protect the natural rights of its citizens, so that basically, if a government failed in this duty, the people had the right to alter or abolish it. This was a radical departure from the divine right of kings, which at the time was a really progressive idea. That is actually what drove me to wonder, how such ideas have now become a justification for many conservatives. That's where Levin comes in.
Oh, okay, now I get it. As you said, those were totally groundbreaking ideas. It's remarkable how they have endured. So now then, let's turn to Mark Levin's Liberty and Tyranny then. Why this book?
Well, given that it was a bestseller back in the day, it was published 2009. I thought it had, at some level, shaped modern American conservatism. Moreover, what fascinated me was Levin's explicit engagement with the Declaration of Independence. He frames his manifesto as a defense of these principles in the face of what he perceives as modern threats to liberty. Something that is also interesting to remark is that Levin's work came out during a time when political polarization started to rise in the U.S. So I wanted to explore how Levin reinterprets Jefferson's ideas for a modern audience.
That's amazing.
It certainly is. But what's more, Levin not only takes Jefferson ideas, but also he uses a similar style. It is like if he wanted to channel him and borrow some of that authority, the weight of history to give his own argument more strength.
Clever. Okay, so let's transition to Liberty and Tyranny. How does Levin connect it to Jefferson's Declaration? I'm really curious to know.
Levin's central argument is that modern conservatism is the true heir to Jeffersonian ideals, particularly because of the emphasis on individual liberty and limited government. For instance, in the first chapter, he quotes the Declaration's assertion that governments exist to secure individual rights and uses it to critique what he calls statism or government intervention, arguing that it directly rejects the principles of the Declaration.
Oh, I see. It could make sense. But is it actually like that? Does Levin's interpretation align with Jefferson's original intent, or there is more to it?
Not entirely. While Levin draws on the Declaration's language to support his vision, he often simplifies or selectively interprets its principles. For example, Jefferson acknowledges that governments must sometimes intervene to secure rights and ensure equality. Levin, however, portrays almost any form of government intervention as a step toward tyranny. It's a selective reading that aligns more with modern conservative ideology than with Jefferson's nuanced vision.
That's an interesting critique. Are there any other examples of this selective reading?
Of course. Another example is in the approach to the notion of change. Levin uses a specific quote from the Declaration, which argues that revolution must be carried out with prudence, hence reasoning that a change nowadays has to be also accomplished this way too. He justifies modern conservatives, like the Founding Fathers, are open for change, but the necessity has to be certain.
Yeah, but as I see it, revolution and change have different connotations, right?
Exactly. Like, he blurs the line between these two concepts. Plus, dictating when carrying out a change in society becomes prudent or not can be quite subjective, don't you think?
You're absolutely right. Some might consider imprudent a certain alteration, while others may consider it totally necessary. Okay, so there are more instances of this in Liberty and Tyranny?
Yeah. For instance, with the matters of religion and immigration. Regarding the former, Levin also criticizes secularists, claiming that they reject the idea of God given rights, which he sees as central to the Declaration.
Interesting. But is that really what the Declaration says? I mean, the founders weren't exactly a unified group when it came to religion, right?
That's true. Jefferson, for example, he was a deist. Moreover, he also wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which basically argued for separation of church and state. So, Levin's interpretation of the Declaration's stance on religion might be a bit, well, oversimplified.
Right, I see. He ignored all those nuances in the founders' views on faith. And you mentioned he also uses this technique regarding immigration, isn't it? That nowadays is a hot topic, rather problematic.
Couldn't agree more. In this case, what Levin does is to claim again the phrase about the consent of the governed to argue against current immigration policy. He says that the Americans haven't agreed to the levels of immigration we see today, which is kinda ironic since considering he totally overlooks a grievance in the Declaration where Jefferson criticizes King George for obstructing immigration to the colonies.
You don't say, but that's a quite important statement to just have it omitted.
I know, right? That really shows the importance of reading these foundational texts critically, you know? We need to be aware that even influential people, like Levin, might be using these texts to, well, to push their own ideas.
For sure, but not only that, you've also mentioned that his writing style also mimics Jefferson's. So how about we break down some of those stylistic?
Sounds good to me. Both texts use rhetorical devices like anaphora, the repetition of the same sound at the beginning of a sentence. Juxtaposition, two opposite ideas put right next to each other, and emotionally charged language to persuade their audiences. In the Declaration, Jefferson repeats he has to emphasize the grievances against King George, creating a rhythm and highlighting British oppression. Similarly, Levin uses the status does to frame modern liberals as antagonists to conservative values. This repetition creates a sense of urgency and draws a clear line between us and them. You know, to create this otherness, this kind of rhetoric is pretty used in populism.
So, it is like he's saying, look, I write like Jefferson, so my ideas must be in line with the Declaration too? Is that so? Do you think he actually does it consciously? Is it, you know, maybe it's more subconscious, just this deep respect for the text that's kind of bleeding through his writing?
That's a great question, and honestly, it could be a little bit of both. But I think he is actually doing it intentionally to bolster his arguments. For instance, like I said, both authors use carefully chosen language to strengthen their arguments. Jefferson talks about the British plundering our seas and ravaging our coasts. That kind of language, it really pulls you in, makes you feel the injustice of it all. Levin does that too, you know. He describes statism as this force that's trying to pull you in, to destroy your liberty. It's like he's painting this picture of something scary, right? this threat that we need to fight against, kind of like how Jefferson calls the colonists for action. These choices create a tone of authority and conviction in both texts.
That's a fascinating comparison. It is like an epic battle for the soul of America. It's fascinating how the choice of certain words can evoke specific emotions while suppressing others.
Exactly, it is presented like that. So then, essentially, by echoing Jefferson, Levin taps into the cultural and historical weight of the Declaration, giving his arguments a sense of legitimacy and continuity. However, it also risks oversimplifying complex issues by framing them in stark terms.
I see. Okay, now let's zoom out for a moment. What do these parallels between Jefferson and Levin tell us about the influence of the Declaration?
They show how foundational texts can be used to address contemporary issues. The Declaration remains a powerful rhetorical tool because of its universal principles and eloquent language. However, its invocation in modern debates, as in Levin's case, often reflects the interpreter's own ideological goals rather than Jefferson's original intent.
Do you think this reinterpretation diminishes the Declaration's significance? I mean, because of the oversimplifying thing.
Not necessarily. If anything, it highlights its adaptability and continued relevance. But it sure does underscore the importance of critically engaging with how these principles are used and whether they remain true to their original context. Like we said before, developing a critical mindset about these issues is crucial so then people will get their own conclusions.
I totally agree. Okay, so as we approach the end of our discussion, what insights do you hope listeners take away from your research?
I hope they see the value in examining historical texts through a critical lens. The Declaration of Independence is not just a relic of the past. It is a living document that continues to shape political discourses. But we must be mindful of how its principles are invoked and whether those invocations align with its original ethos. Levin's Liberty and Tyranny is a case study in how foundational ideas can be adapted, for better or worse, to serve modern ideologies. I'm not saying his ideas are wrong or right, but that sometimes he, or anyone actually, can get a little too biased.
You're absolutely right, Mia. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us today. It's been an enlightening conversation, and I'm sure we all have learned something new today.
Not at all. Thank you for having me. I'm truly grateful to you for providing me with this space to speak my mind and for giving my research a platform to be debated and critically analyzed. Opportunities like this help refine ideas through diverse perspectives. I hope to see you all again soon.
Is a total pleasure, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in to the podcast on North American literature, hosted by the research group Studies in American Literature and Culture from the University of Granada. See you next time with new critical discussions. Until then, stay curious and keep learning.